There are moments when a person leaves your life, but not your mind. And I don't mean in a poetic, romantic way that sounds nice on paper. I mean in that quiet, inconvenient way it shows up when you're doing something completely unrelated, like folding laundry, sitting in traffic, or staring at your phone at 2:13 a.m., wondering why that one name still has a place in your thoughts when everything else has moved on. Before we go any further, if you've ever experienced that kind of mental return, stay with me. And if this resonates even slightly, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not for me, but because there's something here your mind keeps circling back to for a reason, and you might want to understand it more deeply. Now, I want to be very careful with the idea we're about to explore. When I say meant to find each other again, I'm not talking about fate like some fixed script written in the sky. I'm talking about psychological patterns, emotional memory, the way certain connections don't close properly in the mind, even when they close in real life. And I've noticed something over years of listening to men talk privately about the people they can't fully forget. There are 3 recurring experiences that tend to appear when 2 people cross paths again after time, silence, or emotional distance. But before we even get there, I need you to notice something more important. It's not just that you miss them, it's what happens to you when you try not to. Because avoidance has a way of making certain memories louder, not quieter. And silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it just means the mind is still organizing unfinished emotional data in the background. You might tell yourself you've moved on. You might even believe it on most days, but then something small disrupts that belief. A smell, a song, a phrase someone else says casually, and suddenly, it's like your emotional system briefly reopens a file you thought was archived. Not to hurt you, but to remind you it was never fully resolved. And here's where things start to get interesting, and a little uncomfortable. Because when 2 people are psychologically significant to each other, not perfect, not idealized, just significant, their story rarely ends in a straight line. It bends, it loops. And sometimes, without either of them planning it, life creates a second point of contact. Not because destiny is pulling strings, but because unfinished emotional patterns tend to find completion in unexpected ways. And what happens next reveals far more about you than about them. The first thing that happens when 2 people are meant to cross paths again, at least in the psychological sense, is not reunion, it's recognition. But not the romantic kind people imagine. It's quieter than that, more unsettling. It's when you see their name or their face, or even just hear something that reminds you of them, and your body reacts before your mind has time to interpret it. A pause, a tightening in the chest, a strange stillness in your thoughts, like everything inside you briefly leans in and says, "Oh, it's you again." And I want you to notice something important here. That reaction is not proof of destiny. It's proof of emotional encoding. Your nervous system remembers people in ways your logic cannot fully erase. And this is where many men misinterpret their own experience. They assume intensity equals meaning. But intensity often just means unfinished processing. Let me explain it in a way that might land more honestly. If a connection ended without full emotional closure, without clarity, without mutual understanding, without a sense of completion, your mind doesn't file it away cleanly. It leaves it partially open, not consciously, but subtly, like a tab running in the background of your emotional awareness. And when that person reappears, even indirectly, that tab activates. This is why the first encounter, after time apart, often feels strangely charged even if nothing dramatic is said. People expect fireworks, but what actually happens is quieter and more psychological. You observe them differently than before, not just who they are now, but who they were to you then. And those 2 versions overlap in your perception, creating a kind of emotional double exposure. It can feel like familiarity mixed with distance, comfort mixed with tension, like your mind is trying to reconcile 2 timelines that no longer match perfectly. And here's the part most people don't admit to themselves. You are not only reacting to them, you are reacting to the version of you that existed around them. Because certain people don't just leave memories of themselves behind, they leave versions of you behind too. a mindset, a confidence level, a vulnerability you don't usually revisit. So when they return, even briefly, you don't just see them, you see an old self of yours standing next to them in memory, and that can be deeply disorienting. Now, here's where the psychological tension builds, because recognition alone doesn't explain what happens next. After that initial moment, after the body reacts and the mind catches up, something else begins to surface. A quiet internal negotiation. Not about whether you miss them, but about what it would mean if they stayed in your life again. And that's where the second thing begins to form. The second thing that happens is what I call emotional rewriting. And I want you to really stay with this because this is where most men quietly lose clarity about what they're feeling. When someone reappears after time apart, your mind doesn't just meet them as they are now. It starts editing the memory of what happened before. Not intentionally, not dramatically. It happens in small, almost invisible adjustments. You remember the laughter more clearly than the arguments. You remember the warmth more sharply than the confusion. You remember the way they looked at you in certain moments. And the parts that hurt you start to soften at the edges, like a photograph slightly faded by time. This is not denial. It's the brain's natural tendency to reduce emotional discomfort when revisiting unresolved attachment. And it can feel strangely convincing, because suddenly the story inside your head becomes smoother than it actually was. You start thinking things like, "We weren't that bad. It wasn't the right timing. Maybe we just misunderstood each other." And listen, some of that might even be partially true. But what matters is what's happening underneath those thoughts. Your emotional system is trying to create coherence. It prefers a meaningful story over an unfinished one, even if that story isn't entirely accurate. So when the person returns, even in a small way, a message, a coincidence, a brief interaction, you are no longer only dealing with the present moment. You are dealing with a revised version of the past that your mind has been quietly shaping in your absence from each other. And this is where confusion begins. Because now there are two versions of the same person in your internal world. The one you experienced, and the one you've been slowly reconstructing in memory. They don't always match. And that mismatch creates emotional tension that is hard to name but easy to feel. You might find yourself thinking, why does this feel different than I expected? Or even more confusing, why do I still feel something if I already moved on? But what you're really feeling is not a simple return of love or longing. It's the collision between memory and reality. And when that collision happens, people often rush to resolve it too quickly. They try to decide immediately, is this something I should reopen or not? But emotionally significant connections don't respond well to rushed conclusions, because the mind is still adjusting, still rewriting, still trying to stabilize the narrative. And right when you think you've started to understand what you're feeling, something else happens, something more subtle and more revealing. That's where the third thing begins to emerge. The third thing is the one that usually catches men off guard the most, because it doesn't feel like emotion at first. It feels like clarity. But it isn't always clarity in the way you think. It's distance. A strange internal shift where, after the initial intensity and the memory rewriting, something in you starts observing the entire situation from slightly further away. And suddenly, you're not just in the experience anymore. You're watching yourself have the experience. This is where a quiet psychological split happens. One part of you is still emotionally activated, still noticing them, still tracking tone, still aware of their presence in a way that feels charged. But another part of you begins asking different questions. Not, do I miss them? But, what exactly am I reacting to right now? Is this about them, or about what I never fully processed? Am I responding to who they are, or who I became when they were in my life? And that shift is important, because when emotional intensity begins to settle, the mind naturally searches for structure. It tries to organize what is happening into something understandable. This is where many people assume they are getting over it. But what's actually happening is more nuanced. You are not necessarily detaching from the person. You are separating layers of experience. And that separation can feel like emotional maturity, or emotional detachment, depending on what is still unresolved underneath. Now here's where it gets even more subtle. Because at this stage, if the connection truly carries weight, if it left an imprint, you don't just think about them less, you think about them differently. Less emotionally reactive, more reflective. Almost like you're holding the memory at arm's length and examining its shape instead of being inside it. And this is where people often misinterpret their own growth. They assume, I'm over it. But sometimes what's actually happening is something more complex. You are finally able to see the full emotional pattern without being consumed by it. And that can feel like peace, but also like a quiet, unresolved thread still existing in the background. Not painful, not urgent, just present. Like something your mind has decided not to delete, but also not to fully engage with. And if that person reappears again at this stage, not as a dramatic event, but in a simple human way, you may notice something unexpected. You are no longer pulled in the same way, but you are not indifferent either. You are aware, and awareness changes everything. Because now, the question is no longer about emotional intensity, it becomes about meaning. And meaning is where things either settle or reopen. That's where what happens next begins to take shape. But at this point, something quieter begins to happen. And I need you to listen closely, because this is where many people misunderstand their own emotional evolution. After recognition fades, after memory reshapes itself, after that strange observer part of you becomes more active, what remains is not excitement, it's evaluation. Not cold, not detached in a dramatic way, just honest in a way you couldn't access before. And when I say honest, I don't mean you suddenly see everything perfectly. I mean you stop filling in the gaps with hope. Because hope is often what smooths over emotional ambiguity in the early stages of missing someone. But when time passes, hope loses its urgency. And what replaces it is something more grounded. You start noticing the actual structure of the connection, not how it felt in your most emotional moments, but how it functioned across time. Did it bring consistency or confusion? Did it feel mutual or uneven in subtle ways? Did you feel seen or mostly activated? And this is where a difficult realization sometimes emerges. Not about them being wrong or right, but about compatibility that was never fully aligned in the way your emotions initially interpreted it. This is also where men often experience a kind of internal contradiction, because even when clarity increases, emotional residue doesn't always disappear at the same pace. You can understand something fully and still feel echoes of it. That doesn't mean you're going backwards. It means emotional memory is slower than intellectual understanding. And here's what makes this stage so psychologically interesting. If that person reappears again, the reaction is no longer automatic. It becomes conditional. You notice your own response before you fully enter it. There's a moment, brief but important, where you think, do I actually want to step into this version of myself again? Because that's what you're really evaluating. Not just them, but you in relation to them. Who you become emotionally when they are present in your life. And sometimes, for the first time, you recognize that certain connections don't just affect your feelings, they affect your stability, your focus, your sense of direction. Not in an obvious dramatic way, but in a slow, subtle redistribution of your attention inward and outward. And when you finally see that clearly, something shifts. Not necessarily toward closure, but toward choice. And choice is where emotional cycles begin to either repeat or end differently. But there is still one more layer left, and it's the one most people don't expect at all. The final thing that happens is the most uncomfortable one, because it doesn't feel emotional anymore. It feels quiet, almost ordinary, and yet it carries more truth than everything before it combined. This is the moment where the idea of meant to find each other again either dissolves or becomes something far more grounded than fantasy. Because what finally emerges is not longing, it's perspective. And perspective is strange because it doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic shift, no sudden realization that changes everything overnight. It arrives slowly, in moments that don't seem important at first. Like noticing how you no longer rehearse conversations in your head, or realizing that their name doesn't immediately pull you into a chain of emotional associations anymore, or seeing something that once would have affected you deeply and feeling only a mild, distant recognition. Not emptiness, not rejection, just space. And in that space, something very important becomes visible. You begin to understand that some people don't stay powerful in your life because of who they are. They stay powerful because of who you were when you were connected to them. That version of you, the more open, more uncertain, more emotionally exposed version, is what your mind was actually circling back to all along. Not just the person, but the state of being you experienced around them. And this is where the narrative of meant to return becomes psychologically misleading if it's taken too literally. Because sometimes what returns is not the relationship, it's awareness. Awareness of patterns you didn't fully see the first time. Awareness of what you tolerate, what you idealize, what you emotionally attach to without realizing it. And if that person crosses your path again in this stage of your life, something very subtle happens. There is no collapse, no emotional flooding, no overwhelming pull into the past. Instead, there is recognition without confusion. You can see them clearly and still see yourself clearly at the same time. And that combination is what changes everything. Because when you're no longer trying to recover something or repair something or resolve something through repetition, you finally get to respond instead of react. And that is where many men realize something unexpected. Sometimes the deepest closure is not finding someone again. It's no longer needing the story to continue in order to feel complete. Not because it didn't matter, but because it already taught you what it was meant to teach you. And what remains after that is not longing, it's clarity that no longer needs validation. There's one final reflection to bring this all together. So here's the part most people don't expect when they click on something like this, hoping for an answer about whether someone is meant to come back. There isn't a dramatic answer waiting at the end of this. There's something quieter, and in some ways, more honest. When two people cross paths again after time, distance, or silence, what determines the outcome isn't fate, timing, or even intensity. It's what each person has become in the space between encounters. Because people don't stay emotionally frozen in the moment you remember them from. They change. You change. And if there is a second crossing of paths, it doesn't happen in the same emotional universe as before. It happens in a new version of both of you, whether you notice it immediately or not. That's why the three experiences we talked about, recognition, emotional rewriting, and perspective, matter so much. They are not signs that something is destined. They are signs that your mind is trying to organize meaning from something that once mattered deeply. But here's the most important part, and I want you to hear this without over-romanticizing it. Sometimes people come back into your awareness not to restart a story, but to finalize your understanding of it. Not with drama, not with closure in the cinematic sense, but with a quiet internal settling where you no longer need to mentally revisit what happened in order to make it make sense. And if they do return in your real life, if there is another conversation, another moment, another unexpected crossing, you will notice something different depending on where you are in yourself. You won't be searching for signs as intensely. You won't be trying to decode every word for hidden meaning. You'll simply be present enough to see what is actually there, without needing it to be more than it is. And that is where emotional freedom quietly lives. Not in erasing the past, not in forcing detachment, but in no longer confusing emotional intensity with emotional truth. So if there is one thing I would leave you with, it's this. Some people don't return to complete you. They return to show you how much you've completed within yourself. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking whether they were meant to come back. Because the real question was never about them at all. It was about who you are when you no longer need the past to explain you. And that is where it finally ends.